some great speakers today. So the topic we're here to chat about today is from fighting for attention to earning attention in brand design. So we're going to discuss the idea of sort of in this time of incredible change. The way in which we receive information, media comes through so many sources, so many different formats, and it's a real challenge now for brands to find ways of kind of making themselves heard. So got a great panel of speakers today. We've got Dana Alcausin, I've said your name correctly, I hope, Associate and Creative Director at WeTransfer. We've got Chris Twining, who is Global Innovation and Media Director for Kering at Dentsu. And we've got Christie Morgan, who's a Creative Director and Digital Artist. And those of you who may know her from her previous role as founder of Pitch Studios. So before we kick things off, I'm going to invite all of our speakers to introduce themselves properly and tell them just a little bit more about who they are and what they do. And Dana, why don't you begin?
Yeah, hi, I'm Dee, Associate Creative Director of WeTransfer Advertising Studio. So I lead the advertising creative team that is responsible for the ads that you see on the platform product, as well as creating these beautiful ads with our trusted brands. We also work on social and artist causes for the platform. Some of the favorite projects that we've got to work on are things like the Royal Academy Art project that we launched in 2020, where we showcased 1,200 artworks on the WeTransfer product. And then last year we were lucky enough to work with Marina Abramovich on 2 separate occasions. One was on an interactive video project on the Abramovich method, and then the second was Traces, which was like a digital representation of an exhibition that we actually launched here in London late last year. Really happy to be here talking about design and advertising, so thank you very much.
Perfect. Chris?
Morning, everyone. So I'm Chris. I am the Innovation Partnerships Director over at Dentsu, and I work across all of the Kering brands. So that's like Gucci, Balenciaga, Saint Laurent, etc. And with my role, it's really kind of looking at new technologies and how we can explore those different spaces for those brands, whilst also having obviously that creative lens that luxury fashion has. So we work really closely with the WeTransfer guys, have done for the last kind of 6 or 7 months since we had the account at the agency. And then previously I was working on the likes of Burberry as well, so worked with these guys for years. And yeah, I think for us, it's really kind of trying to discover how we can kind of break through that sea of sameness that's happening in the advertising space now. And I think we're going to delve into that a little bit more, so I won't say too much now. But yeah, thanks for having me here.
Thanks. Christie?
Hi, thanks for having me as well. As you said already, I'm a creative director, digital artist, a designer as well. For the past 5 years, up until recently, I was running my own studio, which was sort of a hybrid art design studio called Pitch, where we kind of focused on creating images, stories, experiences, using tools like CGI, AR, VR, XR, and interactive platforms to kind of tell interesting and unique storytelling narratives. I have a pretty deep interest in sort of internet and digital culture, and that's, I think, a big part of what translates into the work. It's something that I always try and infuse into my practice, and now being a freelancer, that's something that I want to take with me. I think I'm also really interested in projects that are cross-disciplinary or cross-platform, so that it can exist on various different platforms, and kind of thinking about brand, if you're working with a brand, experiences across various different platforms and how they kind of connect with an audience. Some of the clients I've worked with have been companies like Nike, Selfridges, Puma. I've worked a little bit with like companies like the Future Laboratory and IM, if you're familiar with them, and had some pretty close relationships with some tech companies like Snap, for example. I'm just really interested in all things digital and physical, but kind of acknowledging that they exist across, we all exist across different platforms, whether that be physical and digital. So, yeah.
Great. And Dee, I'm going to come to you first. I think it'd be great to hear, to sort of kick things off, a little bit more about the design approach and philosophy of WeTransfer, and, a little bit about how the platform evolved from being what was essentially in the early days just a very beautiful file sharing service to sort of something that's really experimenting and kind of at the cutting edge of advertising and brand design.
Yeah, so I mean, WeTransfer started 13 years ago by creatives, for creatives, and originally the problem that they were trying to solve was just sending files to clients. Right back then, you had to send a hard drive through the mail, and these days you can send a file. And I think initially they started out, they wanted to make something that, you know, was useful initially, it's a functional product, and then behind the scenes there was always beautiful artworks showcased. As soon as we sort of moved into advertising, that philosophy of making sure that what we were presenting in the background, or the wallpaper as we call it, we felt should convey the same sort of philosophy. So that thinking around how important design is, and also in terms of when you're transferring a file, that like high cognitive load, when you're in the middle of a deadline, you're sending something to a client, you don't want to be bombarded with lots of messages. So I think the approach that WeTransfer takes when it comes to advertising, which is I think unique to the marketplace, is that we always try and make sure that the experience is delightful to a user and it respects their time and also the experience that they're kind of going through.
Amazing. And maybe you can talk us through maybe a couple of kind of recent campaigns you've worked on, and you know what makes them kind of different, and also like maybe reveal a little bit more about kind of what goes on behind the scenes and what, you know, what happens with your team in terms of making these kind of full screen experiences.
Yeah, I don't know that many people know, but there's quite a big team behind the ads that you see. So there's about 40 of us working behind the scenes, designers, copywriters, and engineers. Some of the more recent projects I can think of were with Netflix, for example. Last year we did a campaign for Ferry, which was a film about an Amsterdam gangster. That was actually really interesting because initially when we pitched to the client, they really wanted to showcase the product as part of the ad. You know, how can we bring, you know, the transfer experience into the advertising? And then in the end, we ended up going with a concept where we had a notification appear on the desktop screen, mimicking sort of a narrative that was woven through the film. It's also like a recognizable like experience that we all have when we open our phone and we get a notification on WhatsApp. But what was really fun was when we worked with Netflix, they were actually able to get the actor from Ferry to record a custom message referring to them sending a file. And I think it's that experience where the user's kind of part of the ad that makes it really unique. And then, yeah, behind the scenes, a lot of work that took, I think, 4 or 5 weeks to actually develop. But yeah, it was a really fun one.
And you have the same team working on all your different campaigns, right? So it's sort of everything from the more arty stuff to the sort of pure brand stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's really nice, you know, because we get to work with really amazing brands like the ones that Chris manages, but we also get to work on these arts and culture kind of projects like the Marina project last year. So we are able to kind of cross between the two and kind of borrow ideas and experiment with brands, but also with these institutions.
And Chris, I'm going to come to you because maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of the campaigns that you've been involved with, really, and what you've kind of learned about what goes into making something, you know, a campaign successful.
Yeah, sure thing. So I don't know if anyone has experience of working with luxury brands, but it can be a real headache, putting it nicely. So I think when we work with a media team, sometimes there's a bit of disconnect with their image teams and their creative teams. And having done this now for quite a while, you really have to kind of try and navigate that relationship. And that means sometimes that we might just do like a static ad and it's very much kind of been purposely created by the image team. But what we've been able to do really is like build up that trust. And where you start from something like that can be just like a static image, you can start to get a little bit more playful with it. And that's where I think the strength lies in a platform like WeTransfer, for example, because I mentioned at the beginning, when you think about the digital advertising space now, everything looks the same. Our job in that space is to make ads not look like ads, so people interact with them. But I think that really kind of steers away from advertising being an art form, and some people may disagree with that statement, but I really do believe that, especially in the luxury fashion space. Like what some of the ads that are created are just beautiful. So I think it really starts with kind of building that trust from the get-go, and with brands that I work on, kind of building that trust up to create some of these more innovative and interactive kind of wallpapers that we've created with these guys, for example, that actually demands that attention and demands that engagement. Yeah, like the attention span of people now is milliseconds, right? So if you can get someone to actually spend time with your ad and play with the ad and kind of drag this here and drop this there, like that kind of thing, it really does drive that engagement and that ad recall. And yeah, that's really where the trust has been built, basically. It means that our brands will keep coming back for more, because there isn't anything really like it that exists that you can actually have that interactivity.
And how important is it to kind of have the art of discovery when you're kind of trying to drive brand awareness? Like, how do you kind of, how do you attract attention? How do you sort of strike the balance of like attracting attention, but not making your audience feel like you're kind of pushing them something at them?
Yeah, I think when we think about the art of discovery, it is working. When we think about art discovery, I think digital marketing and advertising now, again, it's very much kind of everything is being driven by an algorithm, right? So whatever you guys are doing, you're getting a message that's very tailored to you in the hope that you buy or engage, or however kind of what stage you are at that funnel, to put it simply. But yeah, I think the art of discovery in the advertising space is a super interesting one, because it's not necessarily there to sell, it's there to really kind of allow people to interact with the brand a bit more, to discover what that brand is about. And the more creative you can be in doing so, the better, right? Like, I myself, as a general consumer, if there's something that's a bit more playful and it catches my attention and makes me do something, then I'm more likely to recall that ad. Versus something like an Instagram collection ad, right? It just looks template, stock, it's the same thing over and over again. And subliminally, we probably don't realize just how many of them ads you're seeing as you scroll down your Instagram feed. It's crazy. So yeah, I think the point of art discovery is a really important one. And again, if we think about a platform like WeTransfer, it allows for that. I think there's minimal data collection on it as a platform, right? Like, it's not there to prospect people, to harvest data. It's there to inform, educate, and be fun. Yeah.
Nice. And Christie, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the projects you've worked on that sort of relate in this sphere, and kind of, I guess, what you've learned about sort of how you kind of create positive engagement in the digital sphere?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two sides to it, because as you were saying, like, everyone gets very excited when we see something that we haven't seen before that is really playful and engaging. But then there's the other side of it, which is, I guess, if you're not used to seeing experiences in that way, it can be kind of daunting to get involved. So I mean, I work a lot with emerging kind of technologies. I don't know if you would call them necessarily emerging now, because they are becoming more popular, but that is sort of a hesitation a lot of the time with consumers, is how do I actually use this tool, this software, let's call it like an experience. So there can be some hesitation to that, but I think if from my perspective, I think interactivity is a really big piece of that. Allowing like the audience to engage with it and kind of have sort of a sense of agency over the experience, feeling like they're sort of part of the journey, I think is really important. It's something that I'm seeing a lot, just my experience working more so in Web3 now. The mentality and I guess the general philosophy of people is that it should be sort of more of a circular process with the brand. And so it's exciting to see more brands trying it, that's for sure. And my whole like philosophy when I guess pitching ideas or sharing ideas with any client that I work with is just to kind of step outside of their kind of traditional, sometimes not, way of thinking. So yeah, I think working with a company like Space 10 we were talking about earlier, they're obviously a really innovative kind of, if anyone's not familiar with them, they are, sorry,
I was going to say, why don't you actually tell the audience a little bit about the project you did with Space 10?
Sure,
actually, that'd be great.
So Space 10, if you're not familiar with them, they are a research and design lab that's independent but funded by IKEA. So we started working with them last year, it would be now. They have an initiative called Everyday Experiments, which essentially looks at the way that technology impacts your experience within the home. I don't tend to look at things in terms of home, and this was a project that we did under the studio, and it was a really interesting, I guess, place to start, because it's not something that I'd really considered, other than the fact that we were in the middle of a pandemic and we were spending so much time indoors. And Everyday Experiments is essentially they bring on a bunch of studios, a bunch of other artists and designers to think about and speculate on the way that we might use different technologies to enhance our experience at home, or to create a playground or sort of embody certain feelings or emotions. For us, we looked at augmented reality and how you could use AR as a tool to kind of encourage rejuvenation, to kind of think about your space in a new perspective. So what we did was we created an AR experience that triggered a flower sort of meadow beneath you, and it kind of transformed your space. And yeah, I think that project in particular was really exciting because it was experimental, but it still had some level of, I guess, commercial connection to IKEA, where they could kind of imagine what are the types of tools that they could use in the future. So, yeah.
And going back to sort of one of the points you made earlier, which is this idea about bringing your users on a journey with you. What have you kind of learned about how you achieve that? Or, I'm guessing there's no magic formula, but there must be sort of, I guess, tips or sort of ways that you can kind of get user buy-in, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think we talked about this maybe on our call yesterday, but kind of looking at it from like the user's perspective almost entirely and how they will experience this. And I think it's important to layer that with different levels of accessibility, diversity, that kind of thing, and really trying to put yourself into the shoes of the other person using this thing called empathy that we kind of use on a daily basis as humans. To a lot of people, I guess it would seem very logical to use that as a tool because it's how we literally function in real life. But yeah, I think it's also a mix of functionality and beauty. It's not necessarily one or the other. I think it's really a combination of both. And once you kind of understand that, you can kind of design your experience in a better way.
And Dee, sort of on this sort of topic of new technology, I mean, it'd be great to hear from you how WeTransfer's sort of experimenting with new forms of technology and how that's kind of evolving what you do.
Yeah, I think it's a really big part of actually what we do as a team, and I think it's really nice that we talk about playfulness in the experience. That's a really big part of like our design ethos, as well as like approaching design from this sort of like restrained approach, which is, really difficult when you look at it, making sure that you're conveying the right message to an audience without kind of bombarding them with all that information. And then how do you do that with like an innovation mindset? I think that's the challenge, and it's an area that we've been exploring this last couple of years, especially. I think the one that I can think of specifically is a project we launched earlier in the year called Talk to the Moon, and it was an AI chatbot experience that we had right in the transfer products. We worked with a really talented agency outside of Australia, but also an art institution here in the UK, to bring this experience of being able to talk to the moon while you're transferring your file. And I think in that, we thought a lot about the user experience, making sure that they didn't feel like they were being sold to, or they didn't feel like they were being interrupted during the experience. And hopefully people felt delighted as they were sort of doing, their transfer.
Yeah. I mean, when we sort of spoke before this conversation, you said to me you kind of had 3 kind of key philosophies that WeTransfer for how you kind of structure each of your campaigns. Maybe you can tell our audience about these.
Yes, everything we do kind of comes back to 3 core principles. The first is clean, minimal, beautiful. So again, going back to the point that we can really convey a message simply and cleanly. The second is flow first, advertising second. So we always prioritize the functionality of the app. And then hopefully, while you're doing that, you get a delightful experience. And then the final principle is around inclusion. So we always want to make sure that what we're producing is accessible to a wide range of people, not just in terms of content, but also in the way that we execute. So one of the areas that we've been really looking into this last year is accessibility. So a point that Christie just brought up, it's really important to create this type of content and make sure that it's available and accessible to everybody.
And how exactly do you do that? Maybe you can sort of go into a little bit more detail about how you're achieving that.
Yeah, so it's a pretty lengthy process. So one of the things that we're looking at is becoming WCAG compliant. So it's I think a standard in terms of the web experiences online, making sure it's accessible. They include things like closed captions on videos, alt text on images for people who have screen readers, animation on and off. So, we're not intrusive when we create moving image advertising. So it's a long journey that we're going through. We've just started it, but it's a really exciting one because I think it's a unique space to start playing in as a digital advertiser because it's not something that many people are thinking about.
Yeah.
Can I just add something to that as well?
Please.
I think with big tech now as well, so obviously we spend all of our time when we're on the web in Chrome, for example, and Google at any moment can do a rug pull when it comes to creativity, right? There might be a moment where you have an ad format that's working really well and it's seeing a lot of engagement, and all of a sudden they're like, nope, that's not happening anymore because they say it can be intrusive to user experience and that kind of thing. So to that point, I think there's accessibility, but there's also putting the user first when it comes to all experiences, which these guys have always done, but now big tech's waking up to that as well. And you're seeing it with privacy and user data. Obviously, we've just gone through 10 years of just disgusting behavior from some of these guys in big tech, and now all of a sudden you're starting to see Apple put users first, like being able to decide if you be tracked or not. And yeah, to that point, now it's very much kind of making sure that you can be on that side as a user or as a consumer, rather than thinking about it where it was, say, like 5-10 years ago when, yeah, it was a shoddy place, I think, the internet from an advertising perspective, but it is being tidied up.
Yeah, and Christie, do you sort of find, I mean, do you feel like this kind of shift is probably what's driving the kind of, I guess, the market for the kind of work that you do, the opportunity to be more creative and to kind of bring art and design together in the space?
Yeah, and I think it leans into like shared or co-op experiences as well, and kind of knowing that the community, if you're all followers, avid followers of some sort of brand, that you're all kind of in it together as well. And I think that's what like gaming platforms and social augmented reality experiences can do, is kind of bring people together into these digital spaces and navigate it together. And that sort of circular relationship that they're having with the brand is that they can actually come back and say, well, we don't like this anymore and it needs to be changed. So I think, yeah, I only see it as a positive thing moving forward with brands.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, I guess there's more opportunities? I mean, one of the kind of key questions for this talk was this idea of around digital trust, and that relationship that users have with brands obviously is very different in a different type of experience. There's a question here. I'm not really sure what it is, but maybe you can build on that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, traditionally, brands have sort of been dictating the type of content and advertising that their consumers or customers, audience members, humans, whatever you want to call them, they've sort of been dictating that experience a lot of the time, and in a way, like they're appealing to a certain demographic usually. There's a sort of certain type of person that wants to experience this brand. I mean, I think that changed a lot when we started seeing more brands emerge to look, or not look, I guess, be more lifestyle focused. And then this is a sort of, what I'm doing is more a next generation of lifestyle experiences and products. Inviting someone into the brand is just I think it's more rewarding in general. It allows you to be more creative, but it also allows you to understand the brand a little bit more and kind of get a perspective that maybe you hadn't seen before, and for them to also understand and respect their audience as well. It goes both ways, I think.
I think also on the topic of trust, it's one of the things that I always really admired about WeTransfer, right, was that the philosophy is that we just don't capture any data from our users. I think we don't do any targeting, which is really unique to digital advertising marketplace. And I think a few years ago, it would have set us back as maybe a downside. And then to Chris's point, with kind of the landscape changing and people being focused on privacy, it's become something that is, a positive from my perspective. Also, as a user of the internet, I don't want all of my information being sold around. So it's one of the things with WeTransfer and how we approach advertising. It's always that user first, but also thinking about the respect of the user in terms of privacy as well as experience.
And how does that actually sort of work out in practice? I mean, obviously, for brands that sort of do data capture and then they really sort of target ads at specific audiences, obviously for you, you're now sort of just, do you kind of just try to make assessments, or does it go back to this idea of WeTransfer about being for creators and being kind of, I guess, just targeting people with a good, with high standards when it comes to design?
Yeah, I think it's more about, like what Chris mentioned, is this discovery. I think for us, it's less about targeting people specifically based on demographic. It's actually just about providing this experience, which I think we've lost a little bit over the years, with the internet, with all the things that you see on social media. Hopefully when you land on WeTransfer, you might see a story or an advertisement that you mightn't have seen if you just looked on regular platforms.
And a little tidbit on that as well for everyone. I think we talk about audience targeting in our industry. I think there was a study done about 2 years or so ago, and they looked at how users are segmented online, and the average user can be segmented into about 200 different categories. So it's like, what even is demographic and interest targeting anymore?
Yeah,
it's
people
like,
aren't even using that term realistically that much anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more like we go for like affinity, right? Like I like luxury brands, so that I'm X amount more times more likely to engage with this ad. But then we get to the creative side of it, and you got Hermes running the same ad as Louis Vuitton is running the same ad as Dior on Instagram. It's like, where's the breakthrough?
Interesting. Sorry to interrupt. It's interesting you mention that, because I guess traditionally users have been seen as like numbers, let's say, that equals sales. But I think now we are seeing more brands recognizing and acknowledging that we're human, that we're fluid, organic beings that change our ideas and perceptions and interests quite a lot, and so we can't fit into that like one box, one category.
We're also in a bit of a hype cycle as well, right? If something goes viral, like TikTok's the prime example of that. Like I've literally had to stay away from TikTok because I know once it gets me, I won't leave it. So I know my kind of level of platforming, and I just can't go near TikTok for that reason. But I think, we're getting to a space now where if we keep feeding into these platforms and it's all algorithmically kind of driven, where does the creativity come from? And it might be a good time to talk about something we had briefly discussed around like AI and machine learning in creativity as well, because I know we had some different views on it. But when I think about that space, I think, does it detract from like true creativity? Like I studied advertising. I love it as a subject, and some of the people that I studied, like that did it in the kind of Mad Men era, right? It's like some incredible creativity came out of that era, and now we're getting into a stage of the computer creating the ad. Like I don't know how I quite feel about that, but I know you guys had some different opinions.
I had some opinions about this, I think. I mean, it's a really interesting space because technology, in my opinion, should always be used as a tool and not sort of put on this magical pedestal that it's going to sort of save us or it's going to kill us. There's two ways you can look at it. But I think with creativity specifically, it is about working in conjunction with the machine and not against or completely without the human. I think you can't really replicate that sort of intuition and beauty, I guess. I mean, that's subjective, of course, but you can't really recreate that with AI. And I think the way I've used it anyway, and I have sort of been experimenting with AI a little bit in my practice, is more in the concept development stage of a project, helping visualize an idea that I might have, and then then work with some humans to like turn that into a reality, or working a bit more iteratively with the machine. So yeah, I just don't think that we can fully replace creativity. It's such a unique human thing. I don't think it's possible. But
ask TikTok that.
Well, yeah, they might have some other opinions.
Chris, to sort of ever so slightly just revert back to what we were talking about just a moment ago, I'm curious to know from your perspective, as you're working with very high-end luxury brands, is this kind of new approach where you're kind of moving away from data capture and kind of targeting, like, is that met with resistance, or is it kind of generally felt that this is the way forward? I
mean, it honestly depends who you ask internally, because everyone has targets, right? And one of the brands I work with, they have got like a relatively new team, and they're very much kind of in the detail of how many people have viewed our show, how many sign-ups have we had to this, that, and the other. And then you might speak to someone else who's been around it a little bit longer, and they're like, actually, we know what drives this. It's like, can we capture attention? Can we get that kind of engagement? And what does that then lead to? Because, like, again, we're in a bit of a space in the advertising world now where it's like, what is the right metric of success? And it's such an interesting concept when you think, like, even up to 2 years ago, we're looking at like a last click model. And for those who aren't aware of it, I won't waffle on too long, but essentially it's like, what was the last touch point in that purchase journey that gets the attribution of a sale or an engagement or whatever it is that you're measuring? And because of all the limitations around tracking that's coming into play now, we have to think up new models. We have like media mix modeling, that kind of thing, and it's expensive, right? And this is where the likes of Meta and Google are coming in being like, well, we'll fund that project and we'll get that measurement for you. So in a way, like, going back to your original question, you can kind of bring everyone on board on a journey like that, and you can kind of figure out from a modeling perspective what's actually working, rather than this like, arbitrary, like search obviously is going to get the last click because you search as intent rather than a WeTransfer that has 100% share of voice, all the creativity, but doesn't get any attribution. So you're starting to see it kind of move away from that model and move into this world where you can actually measure across the board. It just costs a lot of money to do so, which not everyone's willing to pay for. I'm lucky enough I work on brands that can afford to that kind of stuff. What about the other 80% of brands where the budgets are small and they need to create breakthrough?
Dee, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you measure success and impact on WeTransfer campaigns.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we still are tied to a lot of the standard measurements, but more recently, some of the area that we're kind of getting into is this idea of attention. So earlier this year, we commissioned a study or some studies with a research agency just to explore like how are we capturing attention in the marketplace. And what was really interesting is, you know, as a creative team, our philosophy has always been, like I mentioned, that sort of restrained and minimal approach, and it's very design-led. What we found in the research was it actually validated that approach. So we saw from an attention metric perspective that we actually capture up to like 2 times the attention of a standard TV spot, a 30-second TV spot, 4 times the attention of a YouTube skippable video, up to 30 times, I think, of an Instagram feed ad, and then even more surprising was 150 times more than a standard digital desktop display ad. But I think it goes back again to that like design instinct that we've had as a company, and then now seeing that the payoff is kind of coming through.
And I guess really, I mean, it's the only place where you see a full screen, you know, brand experience ad in this way, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's the only place on the internet where you get 100% share of voice. And also just the way that we serve ads, again, goes back to this idea of just like discovery and making sure that the user feels delighted as they're kind of sending their files.
I think a really interesting thing is obviously everything that we have in the advertising space now in the West is being driven by China. I think WeTransfer is the only thing that I've seen start here and then be mimicked in China, because there's a complete rip-off called CalTransfer. Someone needs to have a word with them. But yeah, it's like you think about that, like I agree with everything you're saying. It's like there's nothing else like it as a format, which is why I've always loved it. I just wish we could sometimes push these brands to do more with it because of the limitations I mentioned at the beginning, but I'm sure we'll get there one day.
I'd like to sort of move the discussion on to sort of ideas around purpose and value. We're definitely in an age where brands' values matter more than they ever did, and also we're in a sort of a changing world where there are things more of concern than there perhaps were, you know, 10 years ago, or at least acknowledged as being under concern. How do brands kind of work within the sphere and kind of convey value? And I don't know who this question's at, but I'm going to see which of you three wants to sort of jump in first. I'm looking at you, Christie.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the question that we're all asking ourselves. We talked yesterday a little bit about authenticity and how you can, you know, can you use this idea of authenticity to sort of break through and relate to the people that you're talking to more. I struggle with the idea of pure authenticity online because we sort of adapt our persona. We perform a lot online. It's not necessarily a space that we really represent ourselves truly in. So I think the experience of the brand can also, in that sense, be fragmented. I don't know if that's a solution or an answer. I just have an opinion about it, I guess.
I think, yeah, if I could answer that one from a WeTransfer's perspective, I think it's the way that we see that we add value with our brands is always about bringing it back to the user. So any kind of experience, whether it's an advertising experience or you know, one of our more creative and experiential projects, it always goes back to what are we bringing to the user in terms of whether it's through their inspiration, through the stories that we share on the platform. But if even just with, you know, Burberry, for example, last year we worked on an outerwear campaign with Chris and his team, and it was a really exciting project because what we ended up doing was something that was really unique. We'd never launched something like that before. It was like a video in a video in a video. It's kind of very Inception-like. And what we saw there was like engagement was through the roof, but what we wanted to bring to a user was this kind of immersive experience where they could really like experience this beautiful video that Burberry had created on another level. And I think that's where the value comes, where you can kind of take, you know, the beautiful artworks that our clients produce and just kind of push it to another level.
I wanted to jump back in. I just wanted to add that I think as creative people, we're constantly trying to generate something new, and whether it's actually really new or if it's sort of remixed or regenerated or appropriated, I think that's one way that you can kind of cut through, is something that maybe you haven't seen before, is from a creative perspective maybe a way that brands can do that.
And Chris, you kind of mentioned to me yesterday that values were a little bit kind of feeding into what you do these days, especially ideas around sustainability. Maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think the brands I work on, obviously, there's been so much negative press in the past around what luxury fashion brands do for the environment. But I think, obviously, I'm not going to stand here on a pedestal and preach the Kering values, but I think as an organisation, they're doing lots around sustainability, and I've been able to look under the hood a little bit of some of the stuff they're cooking up, and it's honestly incredible. Like, they are on a path to moving towards being much more of a sustainable brand. And when you think about that from an advertising perspective, how can you make sure that that message is recurring throughout? And like WeTransfer, they have obviously their B Corp status in terms of not just kind of what you're doing environmentally, but purposely as well, like giving away inventory. I think it's like 30% of inventory gets given away, right, for creators to create and put their message out as well. I think you don't really get many platforms like that, right? It's all about profit. And I think that's a really interesting mission and something that I think these luxury fashion groups are aligning with as well. And we've briefly touched on things like Web3 and stuff as well. Obviously, it's still a bit of a gimmick, a bit of a myth as to what that space actually is. But I think that as a kind of concept in terms of moving to a much more kind of sustainable internet in the future, I think you'll see a lot of people start to build in that space as well. Like, you only have to look at what's happened over the last couple of weeks with kind of, we were just talking about before the panel, like Ethereum moving over to like a proof of stake consensus, which makes it a lot more environmentally friendly. Essentially, it's less energy is used now on a transaction than watching a YouTube ad. So you think about that, if you were to move a whole kind of internet in the future into that kind of space, how much more sustainable it becomes. I think there's better times ahead for advertising and kind of marketing if we can kind of look to that space and build within that space. And obviously, I know you've been doing a lot of that already.
I was just going to say, I think there is a big paradigm shift as well with sort of like our mentality and our relationship with the internet, and how we've been, Web 2 is, from a brand perspective, a lot of advertising that's, I guess, considered more traditional these days. Web 3, kind of with its ideas around decentralization, there's a lot of people that are thinking in more horizontal formats across those different platforms. You can see things like DAOs emerging, which are decentralized autonomous organizations, which is essentially an organization that is like a horizontal structure, and that everyone has a say in whatever output the company creates. So I think just the mentality shift is going to be a big part of that, and we're already seeing lots of brands emerging in that space, lots of brands doing some really interesting stuff, usually partnering with creators, which is another thing that is not that new, but it is somewhat new, partnering with artists like what WeTransfer does. And I think it's going to be a really interesting space to keep an eye on, but it is, very early stages, like the beginning of the internet, where we didn't really know what it was. We didn't really want to touch it that much, but eventually we will get there, so.
Yeah, and it's an interesting conversation, isn't it? I mean, we're kind of a precipice with Web3, the metaverse, this idea about a new version of the internet is coming and we don't really know what it looks like. And there's a lot of criticism around it being essentially just a place where more brands will continue to press at you in different ways. But, I mean, from you guys, there must be a lot of other opportunities that you see in terms of where this can go and the kind of, the things that we can maybe get excited about.
Yeah, I mean, from a luxury fashion brand perspective, there's a lot of different angles. Like LVMH have partnered with Richemont and Prada to launch their own blockchain called Aura. And that's not so much about like commercial, consumer-facing things as it is about actually tracking where all the products are. Like essentially tracking your supply chain, being able to like actually have full transparency as to where the product's coming from. So as the consumer becomes more kind of environmentally conscious, they can see, was the leather sourced properly, like was it an artificial type of leather, etc. And that's super interesting. From a consumer-facing perspective, I love this idea of ownership. I think not just ownership as well, but also kind of being rewarded for things through ownership. So there's new solutions coming in this Web3 space where, think about any ad you see online. And when you engage with that ad, you're actually rewarded for your attention time through tokenization. And the more of that you own, you're able to then kind of use that to purchase products or to invest it in charities, kind of whatever your belief system is, really. And I think that as a concept is incredible, right? Like, we're all fighting for attention, but actually if you reward fractional ownership of something to people for their engagement, you're onto a winner.
With sort of a tangible, not physical, sorry, because it's not physical, but a tangible, point where you can attach yourself to the brand, because you can see it. Like, the transparency thing for me is a really big one, is any transaction that is made on the blockchain is completely visible to every single person, and it can't be changed. And so if brands are getting, like you said, creating their own blockchain technologies, I think that's great.
Yeah, and I think we're still a way off of it, but I do think that, like, give it maybe like 3-4 years, you'll see a lot of, like, even like you walk down the street now, you scan a QR code, like now it just takes you to a website. At that point it might be, oh, you've unlocked X, go to store to redeem Y. Like, there's all these kind of ways in which kind of that omni-channel marketing mix will explode with these new technologies anyway.
It's kind of playful too,
And playful.
Yeah.
Treasure hunt.
Yeah, fantastic. I think we've got a little bit of time for audience questions, if we have any questions in the audience. Don't be shy. I know no one ever likes to go first. One here. I think if you hold on just a second, someone will bring you a microphone. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for your question and answers. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the regenerative design that's outside, but I just wondered, there was a really interesting diagram there, and it talked about, in order to have a positive future in all this, which we all play a part in, thinking sustainably isn't enough. We have to kind of go beyond that. That's almost like a middle ground. What's your thoughts on this, regenerative sort of future, and your sort of responsibility as that sort of grabbing our attention and transferring that into sort of revenues, representing brands? Where do you feel this is going to go in the future?
To anyone in particular?
Yeah, thank you.
Who wants to?
I mean, yeah, I hear you loud and clear. I think there's a lot around brands, advertisers, greenwashing. Like, everyone can talk the talk, but actually when it comes to putting it into practice, I think it's a real challenge for everyone to kind of change mindsets. And what you're starting to see now of a lot of organisation, particularly on the agency side as well, is we're having to actually put measures in place so that we're kind of checking, like, through QBRs and that kind of thing, to make sure we are on that mission. And it's not just like the CEO standing up saying we're going to do this, this and this. We're actually measuring it. I think an interesting thing we've done as an agency group is looking around like carbon impact calculators for advertising and things like that. So when we think about like putting your optimum media mix together to perform to this ROI, actually you need this KPI of like offset of carbon emissions. Like, how can I optimize my plan to that kind of thing as well? So there are different measures being put in place, I think, that isn't just kind of like thinking of us as typical marketers and kind of trying to sell as much product. We're actually really putting measures in place to kind of track these things. And I think that like what we call our Dentsu impact calculator will become like an industry standard for all of the groups to start measuring and actually making sure we're being sustainable and we're doing our bit.
Yeah, I think another point to make as a designer is something that I think a lot of designers do, and myself included, is that we disassociate from our kind of, our impact that we make with any kind of images or experiences that we're putting out into the world. So I think for the first step, for me anyway, is at least acknowledging that the media that I put out into the world has an impact on people and on the planet and the environment. And I guess that leans into becoming more of a sustainable creative practice, business model, whatever you work under. I guess I also wanted to talk about sort of digital experiences and how when we're designing those, one project I did in particular, which was working with a charity organization back in Australia, and they worked with teenagers on basically their mental health, and it was essentially an app that helped you meditate, is kind of the basis of it. And when we were designing a new, we had sort of a side project that was attached to it, and it was sort of a way for us to go in and talk to students at high schools mostly, and kind of talk to them about their relationship that they have with the internet and how that kind of feeds into their mental health. Part of that project, when we were building we had a website experience, a digital experience, was thinking about the way that we use the internet, particularly social media platforms, and how they might feed into behaviors that don't necessarily serve ourselves, our world that we live in. So things like dopamine triggers. We wanted to sort of remove all of those aspects from the digital experience completely and have a space that felt very like inviting, and a space that you could kind of be yourself, whether that be anonymously or not. So yeah, these are things that I think designers particularly need to be thinking about, and I'm sure there are lots of people that are, but it's something that you kind of wake up one day and you realize that you do need to kind of think about your impact in the world. Yeah.
And we lady here in red.
Hi. It's so refreshing to hear everything you're saying about sustainability. It's absolutely brilliant that it's in the forefront of your thinking. I'm wondering if there are any brands that you just wouldn't want to work with because their ethical outlook doesn't align with your own.
We're being filmed, so we can't tell you.
Okay.
This is a trap.
Or is it actually better to work with those brands and try and gently maneuver them in the right direction?
Yeah, I can speak to that actually from WeTransfer's perspective. We actually just recently launched a corporate social responsibility report where we talk about sustainability. It's like the forefront of what we think about as a company, as a B Corp. And the second being then diversity, equity, and inclusion. But on the topic of sustainability, one of the ways that we're approaching that from an advertising perspective is actually trying to bring brands who maybe aren't the best in this area along the journey and kind of pulling them along and helping them grow and understand this topic. And from an advertising perspective, that's where we see the most positive impact, because you can obviously work with a Patagonia and they're doing so many amazing things. But it's where you've got smaller businesses or big corporations even that aren't thinking about this topic and getting them to see this as an important one. And I think that's where you can really see impact.
Yeah, I was going to add to that. Like generally, I would say I would never work with like a fast fashion brand, but in reality, now that you mentioned it, like, is there a way that you could maybe help from the inside out? I think that's a really interesting point. If it's coming from someone who they don't expect will say something like that, like a designer who's creating an experience for them, or maybe someone on like the agency side to actually say, have you thought about doing it this way because it impacts, the environment? I don't know. It might seem radical to some of those people, but I think it's good to start from the inside. I don't know.
They definitely need help as well. I think like fast fashion is a super interesting space. Like I think it was like 2 weeks ago, Kourtney Kardashian's now the face of one of those brands for their sustainability collection. You're a little bit like, it's not really stopped you before. So it's like, I think they need a little bit of direction, I think, with that kind of stuff. But I think I've worked on some of those brands in the past, like those who must not be named, but I think it's really tricky to kind of sway opinion because, again, stakeholders, there's so many different people in an organization that you have to kind of contend with when you're trying to change a marketing model basically internally. But yeah, I think they must see the kind of impact and the importance of this space with brands that can talk the talk. So therefore, I think that will naturally kind of move them along in the right path to start to kind of change the way they do things as well, because it has to change, right? Otherwise, advertisers won't carry you. And there'll be a time, maybe in the future, where a massive advertising organization like a Meta are like, no, we can't carry those types of ads anymore. So they have to get with the program.
They have to follow the trends, let's say.
They do,
Yeah.
yeah.
Any more questions? Any others? I'm just seeing the lights. One over here.
Thank you. It's really inspiring talks and it's very fun to listen to you. I have a question about luxury. And we talk about sustainability and it's really hard to to make the brand luxury and the sustainable. But what is luxury today?
How long have you got? No, it's a great question. What is luxury? I was on the underground, I think on, when was it? On Thursday, and there's an ad for what's the brand called? They got flannels. The brand Flannels. They got a store down Oxford Street, and it's like new luxury, and it's a group of Gen Z with Prada puffer coats on, and I'm like, is that new luxury? Like, that's the same thing we've been peddling for the last kind of 5 years or so. But yeah, I think for me, luxury now is about, I kind of briefly touched on this hype cycle, but it's being kind of front of mind at those moments, having that luxury spin on things. So like a great example of that was Francis Bourgeois, obviously the Train Spotter, was incredible when we all saw it for the first time. Everyone fell in love with the guy, and Gucci was savvy enough to jump on that and actually attach themselves to him. And you've then got him scooting through Milan, like on his scooter to go to the show. Like that kind of thing is very playful, but it kind of keeps with the brand qualities of he's head to toe in Gucci, he's in a luxury spot, and the content feels very aligned to luxury values. So yeah, it's such a broad topic. I would love to discuss it for longer. We don't have time, but yeah, I don't really know what luxury is more so than now than being just at the absolute forefront of culture and really kind of being front of mind for people when they think about trends.
Something that I haven't spoken about at all, which is digital fashion. I work a little bit with The Fabricant, which is a digital fashion house. I don't know whether they would consider themselves luxury. Maybe they would, but it's a space that I think a lot of these luxury brands can be emerging in, are emerging in, is looking at it from a sustainable perspective. Like, do we need to wear clothes in reality? Yes. But also, we should, be wearing clothes in the digital spaces that we inhabit. So these metaverses, which is a lot of the stuff that I'm working on at the moment. But the really great thing about that is you can also express yourself in ways that aren't possible in real life. So, like, I could be wearing a dress that's made out of fire or liquid, which is really, really cool, in my opinion.
And the fidelity of it now, right?
It's getting there.
It's getting great. Like Vogue Business, they did a thing for New York Fashion Week where they had all of their team out in like bombers, but it's all digital. And you can see it. It's all over LinkedIn. If you just Google Vogue Business, digital fashion, you'll see it. It looks great. And like, yeah, I think I'm a big advocate for that space as well, because I think as an advertiser, we're talking about breakthrough. What if I can get a item of clothing, like a handbag or something, that you can put onto yourself through like a lens, right? And it looks great, and it kind of sways like a bag sways. Like that is a really good opportunity for brands.
Yeah, and it's I think redefining our relationship with clothing and garments and luxury and as a whole, because these garments or these accessories that you're buying, they're not super expensive either. They're like $20 or £15 or something. So you can kind of embrace the sort of digital nature of it, and I think that's another way that we can be more sustainable.
And just my last point on that as well, I think these big luxury conglomerate brands have actually started to wisen up to that low entry point. Like, you look at what Balenciaga did with Fortnite, it was a masterstroke in modern marketing, right? So they released a collection in the game, which you could buy for $8. They released the IRL collection for $700. You're going to create that aspiration with a Gen Alpha, Gen Z audience that really want to obtain that item because they own the digital one. And that is, in my mind, I think that's such an incredible move from them to kind of think about it in that way, basically.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you talk about aspiration, because that's, to me, what luxury is about, especially in the fashion space. It's an art form. They're at the forefront of trends and they're tastemakers, but it is like an aspirational thing when you look at an advertisement for a Burberry or a Prada or a Saint Laurent. And I think that's where it's really important for those brands especially to be responsible and talk specifically about sustainability topics, because they're the ones setting the trend for the rest of the industry.
They're also collaborating with like digital first fashion designers, which is another part of the sort of the sustainability element to it as well, is that some, like with the Fabricant that I work with, their whole philosophy is like they will never create physical clothing ever. Just like that's a hard line that they draw. And so they're collaborating with some really, really big brands as well to kind of help inform that space more and help grow that space. So, yeah.
Fantastic. I think we're
Thank you.
I think that's almost all we have time for, but I think maybe it'd be useful. I'd love to hear from each of you maybe a kind of end note. I mean, we've kind of covered quite a broad range of topics here, but I guess as sort of an end message in thinking about this idea of kind of fighting for attention and what is I guess the thing to remember, or I guess like your kind of advice for designers or people working in this space.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think for me, it goes back to what I mentioned at the beginning, which is respect. I think we're all human beings. We consume so much content this day and age, and I think going back to the responsibility we have as creators, as designers, but ultimately it's just about respecting users and respecting the environment and respecting the experiences around us. So I think that's, for me, the takeaway.
I would basically agree. It's sort of acknowledging that we are interconnected with all these different parts of our world. And once we all start to acknowledge that and work together as a team, I think, the relationship will just grow and be more tactile in different ways. And I think that's it.
And I was just going to add, don't give yourself to the algorithm. I think sway away from just being in your Instagrams and your TikToks. And I know it's so easy to kind of sit there and scroll for like 2 hours, but there's a whole World Wide Web out there to discover. So I think be inquisitive, look around, look outside of what you're used to. And I think you'll be inspired by that, because it definitely helps me in terms of moving away from platform and going and just looking at things with that discovery lens on, essentially.
Fantastic. Thanks so much to all of you. It's been really, really inspiring talk. I forgot to introduce myself to you all at the beginning, but my name's Amy Frearson. I'm a journalist and editor-at-large for Dezeen. But thanks again for coming. Thanks to WeTransfer for supporting this event, and for Global Design Forum and V&A for hosting us. There are many talks, I think, for the rest of today. Hopefully I'll see you again at some of them later on, or maybe some more later this week. All right, thank you so much.